You're probably asking yourself, what is this? This is a bracket for a floating shelf, which are going to go right here. This goes on the back. Got to make these blocks to go over this. It's kind of a design I was making up on the fly. So let's see how this went. Set the table saw up at a 45.5-degree angle. Used my trusty push stick and made all the miter cuts on the face, which was made out of solid material. This is going to get a bevel on both sides for a miter. But the miter doesn't come to a point. It's going to have a little bit of extra thickness here so I can sand later. Once I got both sides mitered, I set up the miter saw to put bevel cuts on both ends. So the solid walnut faces have bevels on all 4 sides. The solid walnut ends have it on just 3 sides. Tops and bottoms are made of plywood, and they're going to get miter cuts on 3 sides as well. And eventually you end up with parts. Some sides, some tops, and some ends. The assembly process took on several different versions. This is one of them where it's tricky. Originally I only glued one edge at a time, but I got proficient enough I was able to do 2 sides at a time, which made it go a lot faster. Used a lot of different clamps, and I didn't cinch them up real hard. You just want them tight enough to close up the joints and hold everything steady and in place. And I'd always rather cling glue than scrape glue. Then it's dry, you take it all apart, flip it over, and try the same process in a different method. When I took it out of the clamps, the glue was still a little bit wet, but just enough where we could scrape some of it off. Had to be careful. We went ahead with this process, added some glue here, a bunch of clamps. I forgot all about these spring clamps that I have. These things work great, and I've had them for a long time. Just I forget. Put a couple wedges in the back just to increase the angle to give me just about a perfect miter on the front. Now the walnut sawdust trick not only fills in all the gaps, but it helps get some of the glue out. And I got proficient enough, I didn't even need that big fancy setup, just went with some spring clamps, 1 clamp, and some sawdust. Believe it or not, the end pieces actually fit in there perfect, and I got some great joints out of them. Just a little slight pressure with the clamp, just enough to hold it tight. Finally, 4 boxed floating shelves. All right, they're good and dry and ready to go. I'd be lying to you if I told you that these joints are perfect. They're not. What's going to be important is how good you are with this, or this, and even this. Now we're going to be able to sand these all nice perfect. We still have a little bit of glue that needs to be scraped off, but we have to be real careful. Some of this is actual walnut plywood. The other is walnut-veneered MDF, and the MDF skin is really thin. So we don't necessarily want to be scraping or sanding too much on the MDF, or even the plywood for that matter, although the plywood is going to be a lot more forgiving. So it's kind of important that when you sand this, that you sand mostly on the hardwoods, and if you're going to bevel it, you bevel it from the hardwood towards the plywood. Anyhow, a lot of scraping, a lot of sanding, a little bit of filling to do. So let's get going. First, we went with some light scraping to get rid of the glue, and some strategic spot sanding wherever needed. It's important when you use an orbital to make sure this thing is laying perfectly flat so you don't take away the edges. Unless you're on hardwood, which you can just roll the edges, make a real nice joint. Oh, you know how I love to sand. These joints actually came out really, really good. I was very pleased. I put wood dough 99% of the time in all my joints, whether they're good or bad. Then I come back and nice and lightly sand them by hand. Makes perfect even more perfect. So I put a little natural oil stain on here, which Gives me an idea what it's going to look like, but also it's going to highlight where there's still a little bit of glue. And I can come back and just lightly sand that by hand. Well, while the oil stain is drying, and before we have any clear finish on it, we're going to start putting these blocks in, which was a heck of a process. I had to make a jig for the drill press that would keep the bit 90 degrees to the piece while I tried to bore a hole down through the center. Once I was pretty sure it was lined up and square, I went ahead and clamped it tight and started a tedious process of boring only about halfway through, 16 times. Now, to get all the way through, I figured I could just do this with the same bit, which was almost near impossible, so I tried this, and that didn't work any better, so I bought a new bit, an auger bit that was a lot longer, but it was the wrong one. So I had to drive back to Home Depot and get the right one, and then started this whole process over. Here's a problem with the auger bit. The screw tip binds, and it binds all the time. My drill press wasn't strong enough and it kept binding. So I had to try something else. So I reverted to this, and that blew out the end. So I had to take my brand new $30 bit, you can see right there, and I ground the auger screw tip off of it. And that worked great. 16 times. I figured it was a good idea to glue these things in and then go ahead and slide the brackets in before the glue had set up so that they would fit perfect later. And I actually use the brackets more or less as a clamp to hold it in place. All right, they're actually looking really good. You can't even hardly see any of the miters on the edge. Just a couple quick thoughts on this build. In a lot of ways, I made this harder on myself than it had to be. If I'd gone with solids rather than the plywood or the MDF, it'd been a lot easier to sand all the edges. And to even simplify matters, if I made the whole thing out of solid walnut, a lot easier. The only problem with solid wood is that it's heavier, more expensive, and it can have a tendency to kind of want to go out of shape from time to time. So this, it's a lot more stable, but if I ever do it in the future, probably going to go with the solid top. First step is to mix up some catalyzed sealer. What's great about catalyzed sealer is that it dries super fast, nice and hard. It gives a great finish and some really good sanding abilities. Definitely when you use this stuff, you got to use a respirator. So I check the spray of the fan with my hand, then I check to see how much is actually coming off and how much volume I'm getting. Then I go ahead and spray. Always do the bottom first, roll it over, and do the top, and let it dry. This catalyzed sealer dries incredibly fast and is great for sanding. The finish coat is going to be a catalyzed varnish, which is a great durable finish. Manufacturers always say don't thin this down. I always thin it and it works great. Finish flows out so much better. And catalyzed varnish dries to the touch in about 20 minutes. It'll cure in 6 or 7 hours, but it's got a short pot life. Now it's time to go ahead and install these things right here. And you could see that if the director at this house wasn't standing in front of the camera. And eventually I got it laid out the way I'm supposed to and did all the measurements. Put one screw in it, made sure it was level, and I'm screwing this in the wrong place. And I just about got it all the way on, and I had to take it off and remount it. And you're gonna see here in a second. Yeah, let's put it where it belongs. after you remount the bracket. They are tricky to line up and they fit very tight. Have to use the appropriate kitchenware to see how high the next shelf needs to be. Install that bracket pretty much the same way. Don't lose your balance. And then eventually, a little tricky, get that thing in there and we beat on it for a long time. Oh, there it is, perfect height. Nothing on them and then a bunch of stuff on them. Those floating bookshelves came out a lot better than I thought. Hey, appreciate you being here. If you get a chance, hit the bell notification so you don't miss anything. Subscribe and watch those videos. See you real soon.